Our mission was to stop the trucks on Ho Chi Minh Trail. We went in with, I'm going to say, 10 to 12 Americans. We got on the ground, I'm going to say it, 0800, started taking mortars and rockets. The captain called in airstrike. He came in error. He dropped napalm. I saw the canister coming down. We were running to our foxhole. We both dove. Then the napalm went off.
Curious Humanography is proud to partner with Utah Honor Flight, part of the National Honor Flight Network, giving veterans the trip of a lifetime to Washington, D.C. to visit memorials built in their honor. Each flight is free for veterans and made possible by generous donors. To learn more or support their mission, visit utahhonorflight.org and find your local Honor Flight hub at www.honorflight.org. Also, if you'd like to see more stories like this, please support us by subscribing to our channel, liking, commenting on the video, and sharing it with your friends. Your support helps us continue to bring stories that deserve to be heard. Thank you for watching, and now back to our show.
Jim McCauley. I'm a Vietnam vet. I live here in Chappaqua, and we're here in Chris's house, beautiful historic home owned by Horace Greeley, who we know a lot about him around here. But I grew up about 7 miles down the street down in Hawthorne, which is a hamlet. I'm 78 years old. I spent from 1966 to 1971 in the U.S. Army. And I spent 2 years of that time in Vietnam. I've lived here in this town for a long time. I'm father, grandfather. I was married for 20-something years, and I have 2 children who are grown and 7 grandchildren, and have been in many ways. I won't say I was totally unscathed, but I was not wounded or seriously. I got sick, which I'll go into, or from being on a mission, and was on the critical list for a few days, but not from a bullet or from a grenade or anything like that. I went to school locally here, to a mostly parochial school, and in fact, all of it in grade school, and then partially went to another boys' high school down in White Plains, Archbishop Stepanak, and then finished at the local high school. I started college, but I was actually living at home because the college was local here, called Pace. It was Pace College at that time, and I just didn't like that. So
you just weren't loving it?
I wasn't loving it. I wanted to, I had, my father was in World War II, several of my uncles. I said 8 of, there were like 10 houses on this block I grew up on, and 8 of the men had been in World War II in some form or another. And an uncle who lived next door, he had spent like 4 years in Europe and in combat a lot of the time. PTSD wasn't mentioned then. He was, for those years, he seemed pretty good. Something happened later which kind of belied some of that. So he was affected, no question. But I decided then I didn't want to be pumping gas or whatever. Many of my friends went to college, others were getting drafted, and Vietnam was in the news, but not a great deal in that period. That was the fall of 65. And I decided to join the Army and try to get some kind of whatever. And so I did. I went in the Army in January 66, and I had enlisted in what's called Army Security Agency, and went to basic training at Fort Dix down in New Jersey, and then went to Fort Devens in central to western Massachusetts, where it was the home of the Army Security Agency, and I listened to Morse code 8 hours a day. And I was supposed to be a radio direction finder, RDF.
And what does that mean?
It means, well, you literally listen to the Russians or whoever. At that time, it was all the Russians, almost all the Russians. And then you pick up their signal and you copy their signal and you then try to, you don't interpret it, but you try to take the message, copy the message, and you pass it on. Somebody else interprets it. But then you've got this people in other places doing the same thing, and you triangulate and you try to get where that person was sending from. So if he was from the 4th Russian Armored Brigade, and they wanted to know where they were, then there's like signals and tells, if you will, and there's the individual guides, the actual operators have tells, as the same as we did, right? Typing something in. So I did that, and I said, "What the hell did I get myself into? How am I going to do this for 3.5 years or 4, more?" And I think it was a 4-year enlistment. So while I was there, I volunteered for infantry OCS and went into what was called the honor guard. They had some old drunken crazy colonel who ran this honor guard, but he did a pretty good job of it. And this was where other guys were just getting up and going to, a school that, 8 hours a day or whatever, kind of a regular day, maybe a little bit of extra stuff because you're in the Army. We were up at, 5:30 and going and running 2 miles and doing PT, and, the daily dozen was at that time. And we had super spit shine boots and strack barracks. You could, drop a quarter on the bed and it would bang, all that kind of stuff to prepare you for OCS. And
right.
I did well there. We were also I was also in that was called the honor guard, and it was actually an honor guard. We did all the drills, and we would march in parades in Boston, and that was a lot of fun because it was about 1 million college girls in Boston, and we're in an honor guard with doing, various maneuvers and so on. And, the girls are trying to lift in their skirts to lift up their knees to get us to laugh or look at them in order. And if you looked, you were out of the honor guard. Not only you did like 100 push-ups, but, and of course we would try to get some time with any of them later, but they grabbed me and made us get back on a bus and get back. And I was 18. You couldn't even have a beer in Massachusetts until you were 21. So I wasn't any fun. Anyway, I did go to OCS, and then I went down in January of 1967, went to Fort Benning, Georgia for infantry OCS. I was there and I was very, very well prepared. I got there with all my fatigues starched and name tags already on, all that other stuff. I knew I had a very good idea what to expect.
Were you jumping out of planes there?
Not yet. Went through there. I'll come back to this a little bit later, but the man who was the executive officer of my company, there were tons of companies. I think there was a new class opening up every week. I think we started with 220 and we ended with 110 or something like that. So, there was a dropping off.
Some attrition there.
Attrition period. But anyway, the man who was our XO, and I didn't know this till many years later, was in the Battle of the Irdrang Valley, which happened in November 1965, was just north of where I would end up later, or just south, of where I ended up in Khartoum. And the man, Rick Rascorla, and I'll come back to it later, but he was there for about 3 months, and then I think he left the Army. In any event, from there, when I was commissioned, I was 19 years old. I was told on the podium when I was given my commission, handed my commission, that I was the 5th youngest officer in the Army at that point in time. That and 50 cents at the time would have gotten me on a New York City subway. But one other, anecdote there, I remember that. It was July 3rd of 1967. I was commissioned. Myself and a guy from Long Island jumped in my Corvette Stingray coupe, and I think it was a 65. It wasn't a split window. And we drove how we got our, even though we didn't have civilian clothes or furniture or anything, but somehow we got all our junk in that. We drove straight through from Fort Benning to to New York. And I then drove how I got from his house on Long Island back to Hawthorne, which was probably an hour's drive without falling asleep. I don't know, but God, I guess God was looking over me then. So I went because I had been in the Army Security Agency and I had a top secret clearance. Instead of being commissioned in infantry, I just finished infantry OCS. I figured I'm going to get a platoon and, blah, blah, blah. I was commissioned in military intelligence, MI, which, I didn't ask for it. I didn't know it. Nobody told me ahead of time, but it just was. So I figured, all right. So from there, I went to...
Hold on. Were you excited about that, or were you just...
No, I was disappointed, actually.
You really wanted the infantry thing.
At that time, yes.
Yeah.
But there's nothing I could do about it. I didn't even have a clue to how to do anything about it at the time. So I went to Fort Holabird, Maryland for Intel Officer School and was trained at, now I'm still not even 20. I didn't turn 20 until September.
Wow.
So I'm in this Intel school training to be a Intel agent, a U.S. Army, was it 96 something? I forget the MOS number. But I was trained to recruit spies basically behind the Iron Curtain. Yeah, how am I going to do that? I don't, I speak, not Bronx or Brooklyn English, but, New York English. Anyway, while I was down there, I was the youngest in this class. There was a lot of senior guys, captains, majors. I think there was even an Air Force lieutenant colonel. There were Marines. There was a couple Navy commanders or lieutenant commanders, and I learned a lot from them. So what I did was I talked to the personnel people in D.C. and in essence, made a deal. I agreed to go to Vietnamese language school as long as they gave me jump school, airborne school, special forces school, and a special forces assignment. And I won't go through all the detail, but when I was commissioned, there was a time difference. So by doing that deal, I extended my time as an officer, whereas I would have had only 2 years, and I probably would have been sent to Vietnam, but not necessarily.
Right.
As an intel officer. And so I went to jump school, and I went to language school at Fort Bliss, Texas, in Juarez, next to Juarez, Mexico. So I'm being taught Vietnamese by Vietnamese young women and a few young men who their fathers were diplomats or senior military people, and then going to the bullfights on Sundays, across the river in Juarez. And I won't go into
You're getting a real cultural experience down there.
There was another, and the whole Juarez thing was, how shall we say? At that time, this was now 1968, it was the divorce capital of North America. And there were girls that I went to high school with that came down there to get divorced.
Why? No, why is that?
Because it wasn't really legal or very legal in the United States.
Oh.
And it was
You just crossed the border.
It was recognized.
Yeah.
And a girl more than one, but one girl that I dated in high school, I never got her. And which that also added to Friday nights and the weekends. Most of us in language school were first and second lieutenants, and in our early 20s, maybe some of the guys were college graduates, and so we were officers, and we all knew where we were going. We were in Vietnamese language school, so where the hell are we going to go, right? And so it added some, extra, how shall we say, had entertainment value, and there was all these usually young divorced women or women who wanted to be divorced. So, everybody says, "Oh, you were in Vietnam. You're a Vietnam vet." Oh my God, we're so sorry. people don't want anyway. There were good parts to be in it. There were interesting and fun parts to be in the Army. And I went to the Q course at Bragg, and then I ended up in Okinawa. I was assigned to the 1st Special Forces Group in Okinawa, November of '68. Went over there, and then I was there. I remember I was still there at Christmas because I remember there was a bombing halt. And by this time, I'm a first lieutenant, and the captain, who was my, nearest boss, I guess, he was there with his family, with a wife and a couple of kids. So I volunteered, and I took officer of the day or duty officer for the night. And we were at the headquarters of the first group was right next to, literally along the runway of Kadena Air Base. And it was supposed to be a bombing halt, but the B-52s were taking off all night long, from 6 p.m., 1800 hours to, all till midnight. And then they were coming back. So there was, not that you wouldn't get sleep anyway on a duty officer, but it was, there wasn't any, there must not have been any bombing halt, let's put it that way.
What were you doing were you doing a lot of training on Okinawa, or what were you doing mostly?
Not much. No, I was just kind of getting situated and everything. And then I guess it must have been December, the request came down for some of us to go down to Vietnam. At the time, I knew it was to Special Forces. I mean, it was within Special Forces, but I didn't know exactly what it was. And I raised my hand, and and so in January of '69, I went down. I think got down there maybe January 20th or something of '69, and on a TDY mission. And then I was assigned to SOG, Studies and Observations Group, which was ostensibly part of the 5th Special Forces Group, but that was pretty much on paper. We were somewhat separate. We had 3 main FOBs, Da Nang, Kontum, where I was at CCC, and then CCS at Ba Me Tuot. And our mission was virtually everyone in the FOBs was Special Forces. SOG and the SOG headquarters, there were other areas. There was POW missions, there was PSYOPs, there was other kinds of research and intel. Earlier, they had been putting Vietnamese and Chu Hois, people who defected back into North Vietnam. That was going on, I think, in '64, '65, and maybe into '66, and I was a total failure. Every mission that they put in was compromised immediately. Maybe 1 or 2 lasted for a couple of weeks, but they couldn't keep it going. And they finally stopped it. Myself, and I think there were 11 of us went down to SOG from Okinawa. And there was a couple other officers, and then a couple of senior NCOs, and then some, lower ranking enlisted. And I was assigned as the S2, the intel officer of CCC, or Command and Control Central. We were located in Kontum, and our responsibility was for the tri-border area where Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam intersect. And our job was to monitor and collect intelligence on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was not a trail. It was a 2-lane hard-packed dirt road from North Vietnam all the way down into Cambodia. And it had been, now this was January '69, so they had been there for 5 or 6 years already. Seriously, I mean, obviously the North Vietnamese were there a lot longer, but this had developed, really, it had become a major thoroughfare, let's put it that way. And our job was to go in and try to collect intel. And my job was to brief the guys, the recon teams, which were 3 Americans and 7 to 10 Montagnards. Montagnards are the mountain people. They are ethnically different than the Vietnamese. They are treated extremely poorly. Still to this day, there's third-class citizens in Vietnam, although their lot has improved considerably. But they were subsistence farmers, but they were wonderful soldiers. They were loyal. They knew what they were doing. They knew the jungle. They knew the terrain. They knew the NVA. Not so much the VC there, because we were further north in the country. The VC was not prevalent, and this was now. By the time I got there, 1969, the VC had been pretty much wiped out in 10 of 1968. But the NVA was still active, and they were still trying to recruit them. Sometimes they recruited them at the point of a rifle, the barrel of a rifle. I'm sorry.
So, and discuss what you would do then. You didn't have credentials, and I mean, you didn't when you went, were you crossing the border?
Okay, when I got there, I did not have on ground experience, and I knew that. Plus, I was the S2, and I knew everybody's name, name, rank, and serial number. I knew over time, even over a couple of months, all the intelligence we had collected, because every time you had to brief somebody, and I had to oversee it. I didn't always necessarily do it, but I had NCOs that worked for me who else would do it. We would brief them on what the previous missions in that area, flora, fauna, any units we knew of in the area, any previous missions that there had been, action, there had been, firefights or whatever, or engagements, So I, in essence, knew all that. So the colonel was not going to let me go on a recon mission, and frankly, I shouldn't have, because I didn't have that on-ground experience.
Right.
I hadn't been in the jungle. If I'd been, I'd had a prior tour in Vietnam, and it's been a year in an infantry company. I didn't.
Yeah.
But he did let me go on what's called hatchet force missions, which are much larger missions, and our mission in that was to stop the trucks coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Stop them, knock them out, take them out, try to Now, one of our missions was to try to capture prisoners, which happened, but very infrequently. It's very difficult to do. One of the earlier teams had gotten a driver out of one of the trucks, but what the hell did he know? He was driving the truck.
Right.
There was another time, and maybe up at CCN. I can't remember. I can't remember the detail, but there was someone like a major or a colonel who was captured at one point. So I went on. This was March. It was only a couple of months after I got there. And, basically my job was to make sure that the briefings were done. And then when the teams came back, we debriefed them. All right. So this was now, not an inquisition, not an interrogation, but almost as to, every little detail, whatever they saw. And, some of the missions became successful. They found a supply depot. They found a hospital. They found, some unit, or they picked up something that had been dropped on the ground. Many missions were became engaged, in contact, and were, they were extracted under fire. Sometimes the teams had to, run for 2 or 3 days, and then we'd get them, a lot of time.
How many guys were on a team?
Huh?
How many guys?
3 Americans and 7 to 10 Montagnards.
Wow.
And many of these guys are on their second and third tours. Colonel Bob, who later was Sergeant Bob Howard, then Master Sergeant Bob Howard, was a team leader at CCS, and I'm not going to say I knew him, but I met him, and I debriefed him, and I briefed him. He was later nominated for 3 Medal of Honor, and was given one by President Nixon. Unbelievable. I mean, the kinds of things that people did were, just unbelievable.
What was it like? What was it like on base for you there? Was it pretty low key? Were they lobbing in?
Yeah.
artillery?
Once in a while, we didn't get a lot of incoming. Once in a while, a mortar or something, but not a lot there. Not during that period.
Yeah.
Anyway, on the mission that I went out on, we were on the ground. We went in with, I'm going to say, 10 to 12 Americans and 85 to 90 Montagnards. And our mission was to stop the trucks on Ho Chi Minh Trail. We got on the ground, I'm going to say it, 0800, so 7:30, 0800. We walked not far. We had an LZ and then we maybe maybe a mile and a half to it was a hilltop overlooking the trail, and started taking income. We started getting mortars and rockets, and the captain, I was still a first lieutenant at this point. The captain called in airstrike, one of our own, and I believe it was an A1E. Came in in error. Instead of coming north-south, instead of coming like east-west, he came north-south, and he dropped napalm, and it landed smack in the middle of our perimeter. I saw it coming. I saw the canister coming down, and myself and my Montagnard aide, I was the heavy weapons person. I had charge of the mortars. Anyway, we were running to our foxhole. We saw it coming. We knew we were taking it coming, and he had a 50 caliber machine gun on his wings, and I could see the 50 caliber coming down. We both dove, and we later found out it shot the pistol grip off the M16 that the Montagnard had between him and I. And then, I didn't know that at that moment, the napalm went off. So I'm on the ground 3-4 hours, 5 hours, something like that. And I volunteered to do this. In fact, I begged the colonel to let me go. And I'm saying, what the hell did I get myself into? And, we can kind of laugh now, but it was, talk about, shock. And then we heard all the screaming, and there was a big foxhole in the center. We were supposed to stay there 30 days. That was the mission. And so we went in very heavy. We were completely loaded. We had Wooly Peter, we had grenades, we had everything going, mortars. We had, usually you didn't carry any of that stuff on the smaller missions. They wanted to go light so they could be quiet and move fast and all that. And this foxhole, there were 7 Montagnards in it. Everything was popping off. Myself, and at least I know another lieutenant, myself, tried to crawl to him, but there was just so much stuff going off. He couldn't get to him. Somebody else came in from the other side, a couple of other lieutenants, and they got a couple of the guys out of them. I think of the 7, 5 actually died, and 2 were medevaced and saved. And this is my first day in combat. I mean, it's not even my first half a day in combat. So somebody else, everybody was, absolutely shocked, but we kind of pulled it together. And, obviously the pilot was, he left, but none of us were going to buy him a beer later in the year when we got back to the bases. I don't know if he would, I don't know. I don't remember. I think the pilot, this was an Army pilot, and I'm pretty sure he was out of Pleiku, or there wasn't an airfield in Khartoum. It was an airfield, but there wasn't anybody really stationed there.
Do you think he knew even after? Do you think it got back to him?
I really don't know. I'm blanking on some of the details, but, there was some mix-up in the communication. It could have been the captain who gave him the wrong thing. We were taking income, and he had experience on the ground. So I don't know, but still, people make mistakes.
Yeah.
Or he could have been the communication was garbled or something like that.
Right.
So, sorry, he certainly didn't do it on purpose. We know that. But then, not that night, but then the next day, there was another. We were being resupplied with water and ammo and so on by
helicopter.
Hueys. By Hueys. And one of them came in, and I don't think there was. We didn't take many casualties after that. There was one or two, not too many. A chopper came in. He came down. He said something was. He landed, got offloaded the stuff, and he radioed to somebody that his transmission was red lighting or whatever. And so he turned it off, jumped out, and they called out somebody else and left for the night. This was like happening at like 5 o'clock, almost dusk. The chopper sat there in our perimeter with a full tank of JP4 for the night, and we're taking incoming. Now, it wasn't like constant, enormous incoming, but all it would have taken was one AK-47 or one mortar, and then we all would have been, fried again. The next morning, a couple more choppers came in and mechanics and so on. The second pilot got in, turned it on, boom, he took off. Who knows? Again, we weren't buying that guy a beer in the officers club. And we were supposed to be there 30 days, and we took a lot of that. Apparently, all the intels they kept moving. This was now March of '69, and they wanted to send a message. The NBA wanted to send a message, and there was no VC anywhere near there. And they were moving more and more troops in, and we were taking more and more incoming. And so they pulled us out after 10 days. I guess, all the way up the line. They didn't want an incident where they lost, 100 people, even though it was still supposed to be secret, right? So that was my, first major experience with actually being in combat. I didn't take any shrapnel or anything during that, but when I got back to Khartoum, and we probably launched out of Dak To. We would go from Khartoum to Dak To, which was an A camp, where it was a regular Special Forces A camp. But those guys were always under. There had been a major battle there earlier, and the next day or so, I started feeling lousy. My legs started exploding and blowing up. My left leg, it like doubled in size. And apparently I had, it turned out later, I had cellulitis. I was from bug bites. And because of that, I got double pneumonia. And they moved me first I was in the medics right there at Khartoum, and then they were sent to Pleiku, and then they sent me down to, I think that was to the 71st Evac Hospital. I was maybe there overnight, and then I was sent down to Saigon to the 3rd Field Hospital in Tonsanoo. And for a day or two, I was just, completely out of it. But then they were doing all kinds of intravenous. I remember there's a nurse she was like a young girl, well, I was young. I was, still 20 at that time, I guess, and, or 21 by then. And she couldn't get the needle in my arm because I was so, I was like 150 pounds, which is, like 3/4 of what I am now. And, I'd been getting IVs for 3 or 4 days already. She couldn't find a vein. And she was like, I was maybe not her first patient, but very early. And the poor girl was crying. I'd say, don't worry about it. Just take it easy. I'll be all right. And then finally an older nurse came over and took over and got it done. But, there was just was nothing. The nerves was, everything was so depleted, and I had been
like you were dehydrated or something.
Dehydrated for days by that time. But then I did recover. I wasn't medevaced. I went back to Khartoum, and I kept going for, it was probably, I don't know, that was probably the beginning of April. I went back to Khartoum and spent the April, May, and June there. And then,
when you were done with that, were you itching to go back out in the field, or had you had your fill of that at that point?
Well, I wouldn't say I was itching, but but I had, I held my own. I got a truck. I'm positive. I didn't really get credit for it, but I did at the time. All right. Remember, I didn't stay in the Army, so, but I believe I got a truck with my mortar. And I also had a recoilless rifle. So, it was cool in a way, all that stuff. What it was, I guess one of the things that were going on, and it happened just before this, we lost a lot of people. I think we lost over 300 over the years. SOG lost over 300 on missions, MIA or KIA. Most of them were KIA, although there were a few MIA. And just before, might have been the day before, my roommate, his name was Jim McCauley, he was out on a mission, and he was on a recon team. He wasn't the leader. There was a E6, I think, who was the leader. Jim was I guess he was first lieutenant at the time. And I hadn't known him long, but we were roommates. And he got hit, a stomach wound, and they were running they're running from the NVA. And somehow they were able to, the two other Americans, the one guy had just come to CCC, and let's just say he had a little bit of a sketchy, I can remember, a sketchy reputation. And they were in a firefight, and he put the chest bandage on backwards. So the plastic was on the wound as opposed to the
cloth part,
the fabric, and And they got to an LZ, and they got extracted, and they got back. And I thought I remembered that. I remember taking his body when he came back to Khartoum off the chopper with other people. I saw him in the morning earlier, 0600, and said, good luck, goodbye, and all that stuff. And, that afternoon, we're bringing her back. And it turns out one of my cube mates, we had, 4-man cubes, cubes isn't the right, whatever it was, at OCS, also Rick Miggs, and he had been killed in December of 68. I don't remember off the top of my head what infantry unit he was with, but he had been killed. So 2 of my roommates were killed. And that certainly, that wasn't fun. That's just not, we lost other guys over time too. And there's a couple of books that were written on SOG, one by John Plaster, who was a sergeant. He was an E6, I think, at the time in Khartoum, who later, he stayed in the Army, and he was commissioned. He retired as a major. And now there's several books out on SOG over the time. When we lost somebody, we had a wake, and we had plenty. I always say we had 7 bars, and it was 100 Americans on base. Now there was some for Vietnamese. We didn't have Montagnard bars per se, but they could find their way. I'm sure they did. I don't know how exactly, but they did. And so we would have wakes, and just people would do a lot of drinking, and but you still had to go to work the next morning. And guys that were going out on recon missions weren't doing that. They couldn't, but the rest of us could. And
before we go any further, I would like you to explain for people Laos, and the idea that when you guys sent those recon guys in, they didn't take dog tags and they weren't supposed to be in there. Can you explain that a little bit?
The teams that went in, the recon teams that went in black, meaning no identification whatsoever. No, there were nondescript fatigues. There were no American weapons. There was certainly no dog tags, and you didn't have your Army ID card or whatever. Maybe then we had dog tags, but nothing that could identify you as American. They supposedly had cover stories, but yeah, ha ha ha. But the part that always, really freaked us out is they weren't supposed to be there either. The NVA, they invaded that country. They took over, 30 or 40 miles of Laos, actually a lot more, but where they completely controlled it. And they would bring trucks. Most of the soldiers actually walked. They did have trails, but they also, and that's probably where the Ho Chi Minh Trail idea came from. Originally, there were trails, but then as time went on, they built these hard-packed dirt roads. And I saw where there were B-52 strikes, and, 24 hours later, the roads are being used again. They go out there with split bamboo tied together, maybe mud in the bamboo. Out there, they get 30 or 40, platoon of privates out there just tamping it down. And the road was passable again. So we're bombing from 30,000 feet, pinpoint bombing by B-52s at the time. And I remember saying to myself, how the hell are we ever going to win this? Now, the NVA weren't Montagnards. They were sophisticated. They had Chinese and Russian weaponry and armor and supplies. They had Russian trucks. They had Russian tanks. We had people who swore they saw Chinese. They were very tall, and they were not North Vietnamese. So they had plenty of technology. That was hardwired all the way from North Vietnam to Cambodia.
Wow.
Telephone wire. We could go in and cut it. We did all the time. We just
splice it back together.
Splice it back together. Yeah. They had hospitals. They had underground hospitals. They had, they weren't expensive, but they could treat their own wounded. From what I've read in the books, and I can't say I remember from the time, but the North Vietnamese put up to 40,000 people along that trail to stop us. So, although that wasn't necessarily the mission, it was a benefit because we were taking a couple of divisions worth of people off the battlefield in a sense, because they weren't coming into Vietnam, but they still did. Obviously, they did all the way down. They had east-west routes that came right into the Central Highlands towards Kon Tum and Pleiku. And I think Kon Tum in 1975, Kon Tum was the first city to fall.
At that point, were you getting a feel of what was happening in the war, or was it, or when you're out there, you just don't really know?
I can't say I knew. You kind of focused on what
your task
I was doing, and focused on the immediacy of something.
Mm-hmm.
I do remember one thing from that period. In fact, that very period when was it Buzz Aldrin was on the moon. I think it was June of '69. I remember I had duty officer that night, which meant for the FOB. So which meant I had to walk the perimeter, once an hour or once every couple hours, and just we weren't getting a lot of incoming or anything then. I don't remember any incursions, or people. And again, but like I said, VC they were almost completely gone, and the NBA kind of didn't waste time on it. But we do take incoming. I remember walking the perimeter and leaving the TOC, the Tactical Operations Center, and hearing on Armed Forces radio, one step for man, some step for mankind, whatever it was. And I'm looking up and I'm walking the perimeter. I'm saying, we put a man on the moon and we're still down here killing each other. It's just, I remember the incongruity of that, that it just, and it wasn't any deeper than that. And that, I mean, that's deep enough, but it wasn't like, well, why we were there or why we weren't, who we helping, this and that. But maybe to shake you a little bit, I did want to go to Vietnam. And I did believe that the North Vietnamese communists were attempting to subjugate the South Vietnamese. And I suppose up until I got there and was there for a while, the South Vietnamese people, government, institutions were not necessarily united. The government may have been anti-communist, and maybe many of the people were, but the vast majority of people, the peasants and the lower or less educated people, they didn't care about government. They just wanted to be able to, till their fields, feed their families, maybe send a kid to some school. They didn't care about any central. They had no clue about what it was. None. And actually the same was pretty much true for the North Vietnamese, except that they were under more control by them because they had been under a communist regime since like the early 50s, maybe, since before before Dien Bien Phu and the what do you call it, the Geneva Accords of 54. And so, it became evident that what the I don't want to say the line, but let me say it this way. I've done a lot of research over the years. I've read a ton of books. I wanted to understand it more. And I realized how I believe that our government really didn't have a clue of what was going on. Many of them people, they were all men at that point, were World War II veterans, whether they were actual military or they served in the military, and just about everybody did back then. And we had won. We beat the Germans and the Japanese. And then Korea was, more of a what do you call it?
Stalemate.
Stalemate, yeah, it's a good word. And they didn't, there was a great deal of hubris, a great deal of lack of understanding. And then there were people who had been in Southeast Asia for a long time. And there was that understood the complexity of these societies. They were not uniform. They were not, in South Vietnam, there was the Catholics were in charge, but they weren't the majority. They were in charge because they were the educated, and they had been educated by the French. So there was a certain amount of resentment because of that. There was corruption, which there is for virtually every government anywhere. But then there were all these different factions, not necessarily communists and not necessarily VC, but up until 1968, there were VC. And, families were split, and there was brothers and sons and all kinds of permutations that none of the people in our decision-making, or very few of the people in decision-making, spots in the United States understood and knew about. And it's evident in so many ways that, they thought our technology, like I mentioned before about the B-52s and the trail. And that wasn't the only thing. There was, there were so many things technologically that we were so good at, but they could be defeated by people who believed to the bottom of their being what they were fighting for. And the people in the South Vietnam, and we were, there's another aspect is that we had in 68, I think it was 550,000 American troops in South Vietnam. Who was doing the fighting? Now, the South Vietnamese did some, and they had some successes. And they had some successes later after we left in 73. But we were doing it all for them. We had the B-52s. We had all the jets. When I was on that mission that I mentioned in Nightcap, I was talking to guys on a Navy aircraft carrier out in the South China Sea, and some guy he was from New York too. I don't remember his name or anything, but the incongruities when you go from the villagers in any village in South Vietnam, and even many of the villages had some electricity, they had some, wells, things like that. The Montagnard villages that we had, they were literally subsistence farmers. They didn't have any of this stuff. They didn't have any of it. Every village, or I won't say every village, there were so many tribes. I think there was 80 different tribes of Montagnards, all with different dialects. I remember doing an interrogation or after a mission, and went around and had to have like 5 or 6 different interpreters.
Just for
tribes.
Language. Wow.
Get it to Vietnamese, or get it to French, then Vietnamese, and then my Vietnamese counterpart would get it to English. Yeah, could you really depend on what the result was? I was told. All right. And this, it took a long time, and I've read McNamara's books. I've read a lot of books about LBJ. It's obvious, and been a I don't want to say a student of, but certainly aware of politics ever since. The people in power, especially people have to be elected, but they were afraid of communism. They were afraid of McCarthyism. They were afraid of not being strongly anti-communist.
Yeah.
And they made decisions that way. And then the hubris of all of the best and the brightest, and then after John Kennedy was killed, all of the much of his cabinet stayed in place and was responsible for many decisions and many inputs. And then LBJ had his own, he wanted guns and better. He didn't want to lose it, but he also didn't want to have the Chinese come in, happened in Korea. Yeah. So there were so many competing, competing forces, and the North Vietnamese were good soldiers. They were trained well. They believed in what they were doing, and they were they didn't run and, they stood up in battle.
Yeah.
And they died in droves. We did have, and why we held our own all along, and in many ways we won the ground war, and that's still my belief. We lost the political battle. But their politicians, their leaders, Ho Chi Minh and Le Duc Tho and so on, they understood that. They understood it from their study of other insurrections around the world. Just another, we're sitting here in a historical house. Ho Chi Minh in the 1920s worked for many months at the Waldorf Astoria. He traveled the world as a young man. He actually worked as a busboy and
Interesting.
The man was, if not, what's the word? Conventionally, he was well educated in his life experience, et cetera, et cetera. He did train in Russia. He was arrested and imprisoned for a year by Chiang Kai-shek in China, because Chiang Kai-shek, he had already been trained he already been to Russia, and Chiang Kai-shek thought he was an ally of Mao Tse-tung.
That's so many things going on, huh?
Yeah. Did we know all this? Did we understand this? Some few people did. But, and we had been in, I mentioned Dien Bien Phu. The North Vietnamese used weapons that we gave them to fight the Japanese in the 40s. The OSS was in Vietnam and in and China. They had obviously they'd been supplying Chiang Kai-shek through the whole war in China. And Ho Chi Minh, they dismantled the weapons. They moved them around by horse, by cart, by some trucks. Some, they didn't have much of that, but they had, and they took them to Dien Bien Phu. And the French didn't believe for a minute that they could lose. They couldn't believe that there was artillery, and they were taking artillery for whatever it was for months, for a couple of months during the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and that's what.
Part of it too, don't you think, is that it's hard to ever win in a place where that place is like Mars for American kids, right? Vietnam, the weather, the harshness of the conditions, and it's hard to beat somebody that lives there and wants to defend their territory long term when your guys are not even acclimated to that. Or
when look, I'm not a geopolitical genius or anything, but you look, there was a valid premise to help the South Vietnamese who did not want to be communist, taken over by communists. There was a valid reason, but there was no understanding of all of these other factors that were in place at that time.
Yeah.
If you look at Iraq, we disbanded the Iraqi army after we beat them. There was no
understanding of the culture.
The same thing.
Yeah.
There was very little understanding of the culture and the all of the historical and cultural and educational and religious. South Vietnam had numerous. It wasn't just Catholics; it was Buddhists, animists, sun worshippers. There were all types of religions, and many times, and there were gangs that were very, very. When the French were still there and they stayed in power, they had a big say. And who got into power. Not to mention all the coups, and there was mistakes. Well, some would say it wasn't a mistake, but Diem was not supposed to be killed.
Right.
Diem and his brother were supposed to be exiled, not killed. But another South Vietnamese general took it into his own hands. And then there was chaos for a year or two.
Okay, so let's go back. Now, you finished your first term, and then did you go back and do it again, or tell me that story?
Okay. I went back to Okinawa while I was there. Let me say to you one thing, because it's Christmas coming up next week. I got home on the 4 a.m., December 24th of 1969. I got back to Okinawa on about the 18th or 19th. They cut our 6 months
of January.
Of the 18th to 19th of December of 69.
Oh, okay.
Which was a little short of my second 6-month TDY. Tried to get a hop out of Kadena Air Base, blah, blah, blah. Couldn't get anything. I had saved money. I wasn't spending much money in Saigon, or I went in Khartoum and Bami to it. So I went down to, I forget the name of it, I think it was Naha. There was a commercial air base in Okinawa. I remember paying $800 for the flight. Got
Continental?
No, I don't remember. I don't remember exactly what it was.
Okay.
They were flying, and I remember being on World Airlines a few times, but those were military, what they call them, MAC flights. Went to Japan. When I got in Japan, we changed planes. I picked up a guy who was from Newburgh, New York, which is not far up the street here. Well, it's 30 miles, 40 miles. And he had been medevaced, been like me, I think by that time he was either first lieutenant or captain. And we sat next to each other, blah, 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 blah. We were the civilians on the flight, not the only ones, but not the only military. And his parents were picking him up at JFK. We went all the way to JFK. I didn't call home. I didn't tell them.
They didn't know you were coming.
They thought I was still in Vietnam. Got a ride to, I was dropped off at the, what was it? The Tarrytown Hilton, just off the Tappan Zee Bridge. Called my cousins. Now, I'm in North Tarrytown, still actually part of the town of Mount Pleasant where I grew up. Called my cousins. They rolled their father's Volkswagen down the hill, jump-started it, and came over and got me from the Tarrytown Hilton, brought me back to my home in Hawthorne, and I'm banging on the door. My poor sister, who was a couple of years younger than me, had just had an operation, and her room was right by the front door, and she was scared to death. She's yelling at my younger brother, to come answer the door, because my parents' bedroom was on the other side of the house. And finally, I walk in and I walked in and jumped in the middle of my parents' bed. Probably almost gave him a heart attack. It was exciting. It was like glorious. And then when I told them I was going, a few months later, I told them I was going back to Vietnam. They didn't like it. But anyway, I went back to Okinawa. While I was there, okay, now I'm talking to the personnel people again. I was given my assignment was to go to Laos as an advisor to the Royal Laotian Army. However, now this is completely different because there's no SINCPAC, there's no army, there's no SOG. Basically, you're under the auspices of the ambassador, and this ambassador, his name was Sullivan, and I just saw it there was just a piece that I saw it referenced. He wouldn't let Americans carry automatic weapons in Laos. Now, there'd been war in Laos for a long time, too. The Pathet Lao versus the Royal Laotian Army, and I go, Army, okay? Yeah, I knew a lot about this because of my first. Yeah. All right, so I knew it would have been me and a senior NCO, E6, E7, with a shotgun and a 45 and what's called Trick 25, a PRC 25, a handheld radio to call in airstrikes or air support. And you would be with a regiment or a battalion or something. I knew enough. I said, that's suicide. That's not what I want. I did my thing. I went out on other missions. I flew FAC. When I went back for the second time, I was at Bami Tuat. It was more combat, but not exactly the same. And I just said, I've done my thing. I'm not doing that under those circumstances. And within Vietnam, we had when we had missions that got in trouble, we had recon missions that got in trouble. We had every airplane in the theater, and there were other hatchet force missions, and the same thing. It was everything that was there from Air Force, Navy, Army, whatever. It was all dedicated to us for that period. That was another reason that they pulled us out, because something else was going on somewhere else, and they needed to get the air assets moved. Anyway, so blah 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 blah. I knew colonels. I knew and I had in many ways the perfect experience for the next job that I ultimately got, which was the Laos desk officer for SOG in Saigon. I'd been on the ground. I had infantry, combat medals. I had the intel experience, and the year of intel experience. I had the language, and that didn't matter so much at that point.
Yeah.
And I became the Lao desk officer. But when I went back in July, and I had colonels who had known me and knew my work and so on and so forth, and they put in the right words with the right people, and they brought me back to SOG instead of going to Laos.
And so you were in Saigon when you did that. Is that what you said?
This was I was not in Saigon.
Oh, where were you?
Okinawa when I did it.
Okay.
But I went back to Saigon in July of 1970.
Okay.
And then I overlapped with the guy I was replacing. So for the first 6-8 weeks, I spent time, by this time, all of our missions were going in hot. In other words, they were compromised. There was NVA at the LZs. The reality of it was we had to give, but at the FOB, when the mission was going in at 2,200 hours a night before, they would teletype, I guess, what it was at that time, the coordinates of the LZs for the next morning. They would come to SOG and to MAC-V. SOG and MAC-V, although it was called MAC-V SOG, we were separate. We were near had our own building and so on Pasteur Street, right near the palace, But when it went to MAC-V, we were partners, with the South Vietnamese. Well, the South Vietnamese weren't all South Vietnamese, or at least they weren't all, their allegiance wasn't to the South Vietnamese. And they shared these coordinates with the South Vietnamese. Well, one of them turned out to be an NVA spy. And he had radio contact. So by midnight, he'd have our coordinates for the next morning and get them to Hanoi on his radio. And so at 0600, 0700, when we were inserting,
they'd be already there.
Yeah, and we lost a lot of people. Another friend of mine was shot out of a chopper. Why am I blanking? Freddie, I got his name in here. I'll find it. This is not Briggs. It'll come back to me, but was shot.
He shot out of the helicopter. Yeah,
and he didn't need to go on that mission. He was going home in 2 or 3 days, or a few days after the mission would have been back. Oh, I got to go with my team. Everybody tried to talk him out of it. Why the colonel let him go, I don't know, but he did. And he was literally shot out of the chopper. And we were both getting out. That was in the first half of 71. We were both getting out. We were both going back to college. And, he had been in countries like he had been there a couple of years. That was really sad, really sad. In any event, we found they did ultimately, I did not catch this guy or pinpoint him, but he was found. And given what happened to Colonel Rowe, which is a whole nother story, I won't go into it, but I'm sure he was dealt with. Just leave it at that.
Yeah.
And then for the rest of that year, I was not in combat for the rest of that second tour. There was, I joke about it in that SOG, in Saigon, there were several other parts of SOG, and we all had get out of jail free cards. We didn't have no curfew. We could work in civilian clothes, although we went to work in uniform each day. Carry a concealed weapon. We had black Jeeps and black Ford Falcons. So after curfew, we could be out and do what the hell we wanted. And to somebody who's probably not has no awareness of it, it may sound ridiculous, but a lot of the danger was being shot at by the white mice, which were Vietnamese police. And you can't really blame them at 11 o'clock at night, and we're in a black Jeep, and they don't know who the hell it is. And we're not stopping. We're not going to stop for them if we're out. And, there were certainly guys that were doing, serious stuff and missions, but then there was also the social life going on. And so that danger. Although, uh, at the end of, I think it was in March of 71, I went on R&R to Sydney, which was nice, especially, that was nice. And I was on that beach that was just in.
Bondi Beach or whatever. Yeah.
And came back, and I don't know if I want to go into this whole thing, but I'll try to paraphrase it. I was, there was a mission, it was called, there was a mission that came down from SingPac, I think from Hawaii. And I said to everyone that I was dealing with the S3, my people, there was just all kinds of anti-aircraft weaponry there. And I said, no, that's no good. You can't go in there. You got to go in over here. And by this time, my boss had been Air Force full colonel, Colonel Smith, and he left. And the guy that was his XO was a long-term Marine lieutenant colonel, had been in, maybe since World War II. I don't know.
Yeah.
Again, I'll just, how can I paraphrase this? He was not suited for the type of warfare we were in. He was, I think maybe the Marine Corps just figured put him over there, get him out of the way.
Right.
He just didn't have the mindset. He was probably a wonderful soldier. He, and a very good soldier, and took care of his men and all of that. But he didn't understand unconventional warfare. He didn't understand it at all. And, I said to him, I've got to brief somebody at CCC or the Recon team guy. I said, I didn't know who precisely it would be at that time, but I said, look, not just I know these guys, but I did know them, and I didn't know what it was because I'd been on the ground myself. And no, you can't do that. That's not against regulation, blah, 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 all this kind of stuff, and it was a kind of a battle of wills. And let's just say I knew how to get it done, and I got it done, and I did brief them, and they did go and do
the other way. Yeah.
And they didn't have whatever, but somehow then I went on R&R. I come back, and somehow he found out. So he basically fired me and sent me back to CCC for my last, supposed to be 3 months in country. And now by this time, this is April 71, May 71. We're taking incoming pretty regularly at Khartoum. And, it wasn't a great deal of fun. Let's just leave it at that. So that incident, as well as the incident with Colonel Rowe, who had been my commander on 1st Special Forces Group, and I'd met him and we got along well. He was then the commander of the 5th Special Forces Group. And I went through this whole thing about the spy. Well, they had a similar situation, but he had two bosses too. He had the CIA station chief, and he had General Abrams by that time. And I guess they found a spy in a similar situation, and he was dealt with in a complete with extreme prejudice. That's the term used. And somehow Abrams found out that he lied to him, but he lied to him based on orders from the station chief, and he was actually put in Long Bin jail.
Wow.
As well as 6 or 7 other officers who were involved. And I think to this day, and everybody I know that knew him thought he was the finest officer I've ever met. He's a West Point grad, Silver Star in Korea, or he'd been at the tail end of World War II, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, after a little while, and he was on the general's list. And the man was fantastic, and there was always conflicts between the regular Army and Special Forces, I don't know if it still exists. A lot less so today, but I think some of it still exists. But that happened. I knew that man. I knew his command sergeant major was the father of a good friend of mine I had been in language school with. I was given I got a Bronze Star in that last period I was there, and I got the paperwork. I got the award certificate. It had the wrong name on it. It had Michael McCauley. My son later was Michael, but that was 20 years later, or 10 years later. I decided to get out, and when I came back, I went right back to school. The other incident. And I have it in the bag over there, but it was the Lam Sam 219, which was a gigantic mission that was planned and scheduled and put together, again, with our partners. And I believe this was late 1970. Now, I may have the date wrong, but in that period, late 70, early 71. And basically, it was the South Vietnamese wanted to go across the DMZ and go into Chapone, which was in Laos. I forget the name of the highway. It was Highway 9 or something. I can't remember exactly, but I didn't work that area a lot. But now, by this time, I'm in Saigon as a Lao desk officer. I literally had generals sitting at my desk, and I had wall maps. And I'm saying, you see all those red dots? You see all those blue dots? You see all those? That's all anti-aircraft weaponry. There was more anti-aircraft weaponry there than had been in most of Germany in World War II. I said, you can't do it. You can't. They wanted to do helicopter insurgence. The South Vietnamese wanted to, with our helicopters and our pilots and some of theirs, no question. Their troops. It wasn't going to be American troops on the ground, because we were already, there was the Vietnamization was taken over. And I said, you just can't do this. I believe we lost 250 helicopters. We lost tens, maybe 100, 150 men. More were our pilots, so on. They lost, and they got nowhere. Remember, they still had spies. And they planned this thing pretty fast. So, and the NVA knew it was coming. Hanoi knew it was coming. They were completely prepared for it. And nobody could talk the South Vietnamese or our guys out of doing it. And it had to go all the way up to the presidential level at that point to that, for that major thing. And I said, yeah. I had colonels saying I should stay in, they'd get me a spot at a ROTC at a college. I could go back to college, finish my degree or get a degree, et cetera, et cetera. And with all these incidents, I said, nah, no. So I got out in May of 71. I came home.
What was that like coming home?
Well, although I'd been in a little bit, I wouldn't say combat. I don't know that. Well, yeah, incoming is combat, okay, but you're not firing back.
Yeah.
So, and it wasn't every day, or it wasn't really heavy, but it was enough, but I hadn't been in a super trauma-inducing situations for some time, and I was glad I got out. That's that simple. And I knew where I was doing. I was enrolled in college before I left the service. I came back here and went back to Pace because I had a scholarship, a staff scholarship there, and I had whatever the GI Bill was at that time. I think it pretty much covered the rent. I think it was like $210 a month in the early 70s.
Were you feeling a lot of anti-Vietnam sentiment? Or?
Well, okay, again, I can't say personally that I did.
Mm-hmm.
I know I've been in I've been in many situations since, and especially in the 80s and 90s with lots of other vets in um, uh, groups, veterans groups. And I've heard horrendous stories of people being spit on, people being yelled at, people being told that, I've heard all these things, but none of it happened to me. When I walked through an airport, I'm 6 feet, I was 6'1" then, I was in jump boots, I was in dress greens, I had a bunch of medals, a CIB, and I was in a green beret. And when I walked through an airport, I didn't get any crap. I just didn't.
Yeah.
It was almost the opposite.
Yeah.
Many people said, thank you for your service. Many people, there was whether it was warranted. And because I knew what was going on, I also had a scowl on my face. I know that. I remember that very specifically. And yet other things like I used to stop and see my uncle in Detroit. He hadn't been in World War II. He had a bad heart valves, and he ultimately died from it. But he used to take me into Detroit. He was in the ad business, and he'd take me into the restaurants and with his buddies, and I was like the king of the hill. There's another story about that last week too. When I got out of Travis, I won't go through that now.
Is it a good one? Why not?
It's not really military, but it was, it's a little, all right, it's a little funny. He was the Dodge guy. He ran the Dodge advertising account for Chrysler.
This is your uncle?
This is my Uncle John, yeah. And at the time, there was Joe the sheriff, and there was this beautiful, really attractive blonde. Anyway, the Dodge dealers, when I got out after Travis, I went down to San Francisco because I had a cousin who was there. He was living there going to law school. And he was his uncle too. Anyway, Johnny has his guys, and the guy who ran the San Francisco office, I knew because I'd been through San Francisco several times by this, like 8 or 10 times in the previous 2 or 3 years. So they're taking care of me. So they invite me to this Dodge dealers convention in Lake Tahoe. And so I go, and this Joni, her name was there was the dinner, and there was a thing, and I wasn't on the podium, but I was, everybody knew I was just back, and I was Johnny's son. He wasn't there, but that I was his nephew, and I was just back from Vietnam. I mean, just back. I was like 3 or 4 days back, right? So I got to talk to this Joni, before the cocktail hour and then a little bit after. And it just somehow it turned out that the maitre d' of the hotel was the brother of a good friend of mine I'd been with on Okinawa. So I asked her, would you like to go see the show after the dinner and everything? Yeah, sure. So there was also John Brody was there, the San Francisco 49ers quarterback, and another guy who was a lineman on the Oakland Raiders, another Irish name. I forget his last name. And Brody was probably married at the time, but he was trying to hit on this. So she agreed to come with me. We go down, I'm standing on the line, and my friend's brother walks by, and Jim, what are you doing there? Come on with me. We go right up to the table right in the front, and she's kind of impressed, So I'm thinking, this is my reward for Vietnam. Right? So after the show, blah, 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 I walk her up to her room and I'm saying goodnight, and I kiss her goodnight. She kisses me, and I'm saying, I'm 4 days out of Vietnam, and this woman's on TV every night, doing commercials. And, the Dodge girl, she was, I'm not going to say she was like super famous, but she was known. Right?
Yeah.
And I'm saying, well, so I've got, how shall I say, visions of sugar plums. It's Christmas season, dancing in my head. And so I'm kissing her, and she said, oh, I'd love to ask you in, but my mother's with me. And I said, oh, shit. Her mother was down there at the dinner, so she wasn't lying, Anyway, You can't win them all. In any event, it was, as I said, there was pros and cons. And even in Saigon, that second tour, there were women I had known on Okinawa who came down to Saigon to work at MACV, to work at the State Department, blah, blah, blah. So, and they had their own villas, guarded, they're armed guard, gated, all that stuff. So there were, how shall I say, there were some alternate entertainment venues that weren't there the first time, at an FOB. But okay, when now I'm in civilian clothes and so on, and certainly I'm going to say from 70 to, maybe to the early 80s, till Ronald Reagan got in office, there certainly was prevailing sentiment in the society, and I know I felt it. That is, we were baby killers, we were, blah, 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 blah. And, certainly I didn't like it. I felt I was proud, and I still am proud, and I'm proud of what I did. I know I never did anything illegal or criminal, or, I was disgusted with Colonel, what's his name, Calley, and I understand how that can happen. But it was, he went through the same program I did. He went through the same OCS I did. Now, he was under different pressures than I was. And I had served with Special Forces, and all the vast majority of the men that I served with were, exemplary soldiers, beyond brave. But also, they really understood what they were doing. They were trying to really help the Vietnamese, help the Montagnards. They were trying to, they did train them. They were, now, there were, some people who were, let's just say, to the extremes. Maybe who'd been in the country too long, or, but they were very good at what they did. They knew what their mission was. There was probably some people who were, I believe there's some addiction to combat. There were people that were 4, 5, 6 times. Now, the Army shouldn't allow that to happen, but they did. I guess because it made it easier or something, or they knew somebody back in D.C. or something. And there were, really, really good people who, under enormous stress, enormous, danger, did wonderful things and really tried to help the people that we thought we were there trying to help. And we intended to, at least the vast majority of us there. But there's a piece, and I've talked to a lot of people about this later. There's a piece that there's a high, there's an adrenaline rush for being in combat. Now, certainly if you were wounded, or if you were there for 30 days and you never came in for a cold beer or a hot shower, it's going to wear off. There's a hell of a lot of boredom, My own experience, I didn't quite have that. I had more of the vast excitement, if you will. And then there was, came down after it. The treatment of my fellow veterans during that period, that 10-year period especially, was, Hollywood did it. It was all the TV shows, all the movies, whatever it was. And by that time I was, I'd gotten a college degree, I'd gotten married, I bought a home. I had a child in 1980 and another in 85. It was, that I'm going to say to 80, 81. When Ronald Reagan came into office, he started changing. And I remember I was working in New York City, commuting to Manhattan. I remember reading it on the Wall Street Journal, it was on the editorial page, I think, or the op-ed page, an article Ronald Reagan had written on a Veterans Day honoring all veterans, including Vietnam veterans. And things started to change. We, as Vietnam vets, and I was not involved with this in that period during the 80s, but the entity and VVA as a national entity did enormous amount of good in changing the VA and getting much better treatment of all veterans.
Did you have PTSD? Did that ever bubble up?
No, I did. Yeah, I didn't know I did. I'll also, I don't mind admitting this at this point. Well, technically, I'm not probably supposed to, but I had a problem with alcohol. The reality is, I had a problem before I went. The level of trauma that I experienced and the level of death that I experienced. I mentioned a couple of friends, but there was many others that I knew. And as I said, Freddie, Wes, I'm still looking for that. Can we stop?
Yeah, sure. Just wait for a minute.
Oh, here we go.
Wow.
Fred Kruppa.
Fred Kruppa.
Yeah, was the guy that was pushed out of it, shot out of the chopper. In any event.
How did the PTSD bubble up for you? How did you kind of decide what it was?
Well.
And I'm going to have you lean that way just a little bit so you're on the mic. Sorry. Yeah, there you go.
That's all right. Do you pay overtime for the,
Sure.
I didn't know I had it. There was a lot of anger. There was reactive anger, Now, I got sober in 1976. I'll be sober 50 years, God willing, and the creeks don't rise next April. There were blackouts or outbursts. There was things that were, associated with alcohol, alcoholism. And what I learned later, I come from a long line of Irish drunks, as I say, on both sides of the family. And but I was able to get sober. I consider it a gift, a grace of God. I was 28. As far as the PTSD, I was not getting treatment for it, but getting the alcohol out of my life really did help with a lot of things. I was quite successful in business in my first sales jobs, which I started first one was in 74. Went to a corporate job and then another corporate job, and I was continuing to do better. The kids were coming along. I bought a nice house, the 2 cars, 2 kids.
The American dream. You were living it.
I had it all.
Yeah.
2 acres here in Chopper.
Yeah.
I had it going. And, there was some risks I was taking, investment type risks, and I got into real estate in the 80s, and I didn't feel like I was risking, but I didn't know what I didn't know.
Yeah.
But I was sober. This was not alcohol induced, and it was certainly not trauma induced. And although I was, friendly with other Vietnam vets, certainly, I knew about other people's problems. I didn't have those kinds of direct problems myself that I recognized. There was still some anger and still some reactiveness. I went through a divorce in the mid-90s after 20 years of marriage, and even looking back, this is many years later, I could see maybe some of that was PTSD going on, but there were other things too. By this time, I was working with other vets a lot, and I was now sober 20-something years. And I had, during the period from 1990 to 1997, I had 1 vet a year that I knew well or was working with. I was worked with 4 of them who committed suicide. And the last one happened to be like a 4th cousin. We didn't know each other. He was from Lower Westchester, same last name. And that one, That was the last one was in April of 97. And I knew him well. I had helped him. I'd taken him to meetings. I'd gotten him his job back, and helped him get his job back at the post office, because another fellow Vietnam vet and somebody I'd gone to grammar school with was the postmaster now. And where he got his job back, but he went back drinking, and then he killed himself not too long after that. And that sent me into a depression that I hadn't experienced before. But interestingly enough, and this is just part of what I consider God's will, I had been with all these people. I wasn't trying to do it myself. I was bringing them to the VA. I was bringing them to programs. There were drug and alcohol programs, and there was the beginning of then at that time, maybe even earlier than the PTSD program started here at Montrose, the local VA, and it became one of the best in the country. And it still is very good. I still work with it. But I knew who to call for help myself, because of all the work I had done before. And that's just simply, maybe that's a very positive thing. I don't, whatever, but all of that stuff then came back up. I had another strange experience during that time. Might have been right about the same time. I was up at a yoga retreat, of all places, in Massachusetts, in Kripalu, and I'm blanking on the Berkshires. And I was in this intensive program, and all the people there kept, oh, we're so sorry for you. Oh, we're so glad, you're a Vietnam veteran. I got so mad. I got so angry. I literally walked out. I remember saying, I don't want your sympathy. I just want your respect. I just want your acknowledgement. I don't really want anything from you, but I don't want your pity. I never did. And the vast, vast majority of us that I know, and I'd been, during that whole period, I'd been in many programs at other places, these therapy type groups of veterans. None of us wanted pity. If you were drafted or you were enlisted, it didn't matter. You went. You did what you believed was your task, your job, whatever. Your country was asking something. Yeah, it was all screwed up. We all know that later. We went through all that before. But we did it. We don't want pity for it. Yeah, we want somebody who lost a leg or lost an arm. Yeah, we want the VA to take care of them. We want the government to take care of them. But we don't want, we're not victims in the sense that society looked at us as. And so I went out, and I'm getting to this. I went out, I left it, and it's in the mountains in the Berkshires. And I'm walking along paths, and there was a drought going on in the Berkshires at that point in time. And I hear this helicopter. Now, it's part of the PTSD. When you hear the whop, whop, whop of a Huey, you're either getting on it to go into combat or you're being extracted. And that is the most dangerous part of the mission, normally. And there's this fire chopper, warden chopper, and it's just keeping going back and forth, I guess, looking for sparks or looking for anything. And I'm walking on this path, and it was like, I remember like taking a stick and like shooting it. It was like so intense. And it was like, everything came up. That's all I could say. I go to a yoga retreat to do what was called Inner Quest Intensive. And
lean that way just a little bit.
I'm
okay,
sorry.
There you go.
And I had no expectation. This was right after the end of my divorce. I'm going to think I'm going there to heal from the divorce thing. And all right, I wasn't doing yoga then. I did a little bit, but I wasn't into it or anything like that.
Yeah.
And I'm out in the woods of Western Massachusetts, and there's this whoop, 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 whoop going on. And it's like, it made me so angry, but it seemed like it just lifted everything. And somehow yelling and screaming, I was out there alone. There wasn't anybody else out there. And I hope the guy in the chopper didn't see me pointing at him, but it expunged. It let a lot of it out that I didn't even know I had. It's hard to describe, but I ended up not an hour later, maybe I think, sometime 6 or 8 or 10 hours later, I came back. I went to sleep. I was exhausted. And then I went back into this group. And the group was, you gave me a watch. I don't remember even having phones then, but it was like, you were, it was like really intensive, and people were supposed to get really, and there was a woman in there, I just remembered this, who was a stewardess on the planes, on the Mac flights.
Wow.
So we bonded, because she would see all these guys coming back, guys just coming out of the field, and maybe they got a shower and clean clothes, but that was it. They were still, they were still out in the boonies somewhere. And a lot of it, whatever I did have, dissipated then. But I had gotten the help in 97, and this might have been 97 or 98, later in the year. And I took a antidepressant for a long time. And I still, it was interesting, after that the reaction, hearing the chopper, dissipated for a long time, but it's back. I don't know why, but it's back. Not the adrenaline starts to run immediately when I hear it. It does deplete or go away pretty quickly. It's not constant. I can say, oh no, that's just, here I am, I'm here. But I came back in 1971.
It's a long time.
What, 60 plus years, something like that?
Yeah.
And I didn't have it to the extent, I didn't have the combat a lot of my friends have.
Yeah.
Had. Just one other thing, I mentioned my friend who was the postmaster, and
I just love it. Yeah.
We started together in kindergarten. We went all the way through grammar school. We went to the same high school. He ended up 20 miles south of me, and he was in Vietnam. He was at a big 4th Infantry Division at a Pleiku. And somehow, through our mothers, who would see each other at church every Sunday, I got his address, and I got his unit and so on. So I was able to get in touch with him and his captain. We got him a pass to come out, because we had I remember I said all the bars we had.
Yeah.
And we had shows come in, and those poor guys, they were grunts. And they go out, I've mentioned it several times, the 30 days at a time, And so we got him a pass to come up to Khartoum, the CCC, and he went out on a patrol. He got hit. But he got medevaced, and then he ended up coming back. He spent a year in St. Albans. And I just talked to him the other day. He's still alive. He's up in Rochester right now. He's had quite a few health problems recently. But, it's like the incongruity of we're trying to, get him, and we got him. And his captain said, fine, and then he didn't get there, and then I'm trying to figure out what's going on, and it was, I wouldn't say traumatic. and then I was really worried about him, but he got taken care of, and he was in, as I said, in St. Albans for a long time. But then he had, he got married, kids, grandkids, all that stuff, and had a successful career. It's not that he has problems, but almost every Vietnam vet I know has been in some kind of program or something. Has gone to vets groups at the VA, gone to the clinics, or other things formed. Like I know when I went back to college, the vets, gravitated towards each other. And, we weren't, how could I say, again, we weren't maybe loved, but there were plenty of people that respected us. I know the professors I had were absolutely fantastic, and many of them had been in World War II. And so there was a bonding there, and it kind of like after a while you just didn't give a darn about the rest of it, so to speak. You went about, did your business, and, I got my degree, and then I went back later and got an MBA, and I got VA, and I got the company I worked for helped pay for the MBA. So, I used, like I kind of did in the service. I don't really know where all of this came from, so to speak, but I learned how to use the resources that were available to me. First, what the resources were, and then how to use them, and how to get, get the schools I wanted to service, get the assignments I wanted, get, and then later again when I came back, through, know how to interview for a job, and
Right,
all that.
right.
Now, many people, most people can do that, but I was able to use things that, for instance, I ended up getting my MBA pretty much paid for. I was making money, and I was working, long hours and traveling and everything else, but I was able to use the resources, both the company and the VA and so on, that were available to me, and make the best of them, which a lot of people weren't able to.
Yeah.
I mentioned the 7 suicides. There were a hell of a lot of other numbers,
Yeah.
and the numbers still. One of the things I've done over the past decade is work with a group called Pro-Vetis, and there are now veterans courts. They're all over the country now. I think there's 400 plus, and they started in Buffalo, New York. Now I'm going to say 212, 213, something like that. Anyway, veterans who get in trouble, moderate, minor, but drug and alcohol related problems, not violence, no weapons,
Right.
no armed robbery or anything like that, but DWIs and misdemeanor type things. Rather than them going to jail, they're able, if they follow this program, which they use the 12-step programs, NA and AA. They use the VA for PTSD counseling and medical care. They may have other problems. So there's more things available for them. They can do the program and they go to court, and then veterans like myself, usually combat veterans, not always, but usually, mentor them. We're not sponsors, but we're older people who have had, maybe have the experience. They don't have to have all the same experiences, but know the system a little bit. And they're dealing with the judge, what they call the problem-solving units, the DA, the VA, the DMV. There's so many bureaucracies and there's so many silos that some guy who's just trying to get it, put food on the table, how the hell does he deal with it all?
Right.
So we're there as kind of I don't want to say, in a way, a big brother type thing, and just an experienced person who doesn't. We don't have any. We have say in the court, but only because the judge gives us that say in a sense of many of us have combat vets, and we know what these guys are going through, and I wish that those kinds of services were there because maybe those 7 guys that I know that committed suicide, they were there in the 80s.
Maybe they'd still be.
Maybe there'd be a few of them still
Yeah.
Well, maybe not,
Yeah.
but maybe. And, I have to say the VA has come enormously. And I just went to the summer, I went to the national convention. The first time I ever went, I've been on the board of VVA, my local board here, and I've done a bunch of other things. But, all around the country, I know the ones in California, they had very good PTSD programs too. And many of the places do. There's been some problems with VAs. There's no question about that. Especially during COVID, there was a lot of things got messed up. But it's back to significantly improving. And I still go to a PTSD meeting once a month with my VVA group. We have a pizza party and we go in and we talk, literally sit and talk to the guys.
Yeah.
One-on-one.
Yeah.
And we try to, impart our experiences. And those of us we're all in our late 70s, and we've all been around a bit, and we've all availed ourselves of a lot of the services that are available, whether it be the VA, the government, or religious. There's many ways to heal.
Yeah.
And there's, I'm a proponent of the 12-step programs, but that's not necessarily the only way people can heal. But it's a very good way, and it's worked very well for 90 years. So,
well, you have lived a very interesting life, my friend. That's some good stuff.
One of the last things I'll mention, I've been in for the last few years. I've been going to a veterans writing course here at Fordham University. We meet once a week, and we have a great professor, and it's not all Vietnam vets, but mostly Vietnam vets. And we write, and a lot of it is writing about our military experiences, and everybody has different ones. As we've said before, there's a doctor who was on a hospital ship. There's Air Force guys, there's Marines, there's Army, like, me, infantry guys, there's artillery guys, there's, all kinds of various experiences. But then also everybody has all the rest of their life experiences too. So I'm trying to put a lot of that down on paper and maybe put it into some kind of book, or memoir, if you will.
Definitely should.
Not that it's going to make the bestseller list, but at least I have 6 grandsons. So, and all of them have an interest in it, and they have respect. And one last thing, I just reminded me of this. One of the oldest one, I did for, I'm going to say about 10 years, 8 or 9 years, I guess. I did bike rides, 50 and 100-mile bike rides with disabled vets, amputees. It was called World Team Sports, and it had been around long before me, but I took part in it, and I raised a pretty good amount of money for them, and we would pay for all these vets to come to D.C. The main ride was is still going on, the Pentagon to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It's 105 miles, but overnight would stay about half. I think it's in Frederick, Maryland. And the group, we had up to 650, 700 riders in one year, I think. The disabled guys, the amputees, we would pay for their travel, their hotel, rent the bike if we needed. Sometimes we had to buy bikes or fix them or whatever. And it was the heart. And these are mostly not Vietnam. There were very few Vietnam vets because of the age thing. But I know men who lost both legs below the knees, lost a leg and an arm, et cetera, in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we'd have 100 to 125, 150 seriously injured. They weren't all amputees.
Right.
A lot of people with TBI,
right.
The kind of walking wounded, if you will, things they can't see. But it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. And I haven't done the rides in a couple of years, just partly because of my age. And
yeah.
Blah, blah, blah. I'd like to get back to it. I also myself and a few others, we did the ride here for 5 years. From the first couple of years we did from West Point to World Trade Center, 55 miles.
Yeah.
And that was great. But it became really a problem getting the people back to West Point to where the cars were, riders on a Sunday evening.
Right.
So we decided, we moved it, and we did three rides from the Tappan Zee Bridge. We came here through Westchester, went north of the Bear Mountain, and then came back down. It was also 50 miles, and we ended at West Point. So yeah, I've been asking myself, why do I spend so much time on veterans things? But it really becomes a part of you. I've recently started reading one of Hemingway's books. He wrote after World War One, or was it after the Spanish-American War? I know, and I'm reading more books. I'm reading a book now called "The Body Keeps the Score," about PTSD and trauma, and it just stays with it. And I think there's not all vets by any means, but a lot of us, it became a part of us. And, and I don't feel the trauma. I don't feel anxiety that I did back in the early days. But, and I feel I've been given so much grace and given so many gifts in this life, my life, period, from that first day, from March 15th, 1969. Everything since then is a bonus.
Yeah.
And I didn't know it precisely at the time, but, the alcoholism could have also very easily killed me.
For sure.
And it didn't. And I've been given that, and I try to give back. In that regard, I'm content. Let's put it that way.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. I appreciate it. Thank you.